Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or happy middle of the night. I'm not sure. I got to Wellington about 8 hours ago after having flown for what turned out to be 21 hours from Chicago. And it just occurred to me how dangerous it is to put me in a room with dim lights. I want to thank Mark and Allison and Liz, an amazing team of people here in New Zealand who worked to make my visit possible. A lot of logistics went into this because of the complications of me having to chair the Council on Foundations annual gathering, what was 2 or 3 days ago now. And I've already learned what great hospitality there is in this part of the world. To arrive for the Pohiri, if I got that pronounced right, was truly wonderful. What a warm and interesting ceremony. The other part of my welcome was my old friend Mary Jo Kaplan greeting me and saying, "You look terrible and you smell worse." So MJ, thank you. I had to clean it up. I have to tell you, Mark's met my team. Some of you have met my team because you've come to the City University of New York visits to come to Reading. My team was quite taken by the description of me in the brochure as outspoken. I said to them, we were in a staff meeting, I said, you don't think of me as outspoken, do you? And the loudest response came from our chief financial officer, who said, well, not really. She said, it's more like you're a pain in the butt. The young staff person in our communications department said obstinate. Stubborn was mentioned, and I even heard bullheaded. So for our time this afternoon, let's just assume two things. Let's assume that's true, and let's assume that sometimes that's what I get paid to be. And I want to start with a story not about our foundation, but about one in our state not too far away. Now, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, if you have ever been there, is hardly a hotbed of activism and social unrest. In fact, if there was ever an example of a pleasant place, it would be the city of Pittsburgh. Like much of the American Midwest, the people in Pittsburgh are excruciatingly polite and helpful. They are eager to cooperate with each other, and they are not eager to rock the boat. The community of Pittsburgh has long taken great pride in its ability to transform itself from a steel town in the 1950s and 60s to today being a worldwide center for medical research, higher education, and financial services. And they take great pride in the fact that they did that by pulling together the philanthropic sector, the business sector, and the government sector to work together. Unlike Philadelphia, on the other side of the state, Pittsburghers long ago concluded that they would resolve their civic differences quietly and behind closed doors, and that they would not use our statewide media as a way of fighting with each other. And if Pittsburgh seems like a quiet town with a preference for peace and harmony, and by the way, there's a suburb of Pittsburgh called Harmony, Pennsylvania, you can imagine what the foundation offices are like. It's among the most richly endowed cities in the world with foundation assets, and the leaders of the foundations have always been tightly interwoven into that civic network of corporate and government and private leadership that's run Pittsburgh. Now, generally, there's no more genteel, polite group of folks in the world than the folks who run foundations, and the Pittsburgh folks certainly met that mold. In fact, an article written by the president of one of the largest foundations in Pittsburgh started with the sentence, "Foundations are not in the habit of deliberately creating a stir." So imagine my shock when in July of 2002, the Heinz Endowments, the Grable Foundation, and the Pittsburgh Community Foundation held a press conference in Pittsburgh to announce that they were suspending all grants to the Pittsburgh Public School District, including those that had already been approved. In doing so, they cited the dysfunctional infighting within the school board, which, despite Pittsburgh's relative desire for peace, included a fist fight that had broken out among school board members. They cited the fact that the district had consistently failed to meet conditions of some of their earlier grants, and that the board had begun a relentless period of micromanaging the school superintendents. honestly, by the standards we hold any of our grantees to, the Pittsburgh schools in 2002 were a mess. And once great school districts' educational levels had fallen into such disrepair that it could only honestly be said that the Pittsburgh schools were actually failing to serve the children's most basic educational needs. But the actions of these three foundations in having this press conference were stunning. Three relatively quiet foundations in the relatively peaceful city of Pittsburgh had taken on one of the state's most powerful elected bodies and said there would be no more grants until the school board began to behave like a proper board. In philanthropy, in our country, it was as though the earth had shifted. The New York Times called their action stunning and rare. The Pittsburgh Press, the largest local newspaper, called it shock therapy. The head of a nearby foundation called it arrogant and harmful. The school board president called it blackmail, and the mayor called it a wake-up call. No matter what you thought of it, we all knew something different was happening in Pittsburgh. Well, it's 11 years later, and I suspect that in most places, if three of our foundations took as bold and as confrontational a move against a government body, it would still be considered shocking, but perhaps less so. Increasingly, all around the world, philanthropy has come out of its shell to irritate and to agitate for change on behalf of those who can't advocate for themselves. It's a trend I think will, can, and should continue. And I think we've only begun, 11 years later, really only begun to understand the importance of foundations being willing to take on hard public battles on behalf of those we serve. And as Mark said, I've come to call this irritating and agitating. And by that, I mean asking uncomfortable questions when uncomfortable questions need to be asked in our communities. And I mean confronting powerful bodies like elected school boards with powerful bodies like grant-making foundations. Irritating and agitating causes us to step out of our limited roles as dispensers of cash and be willing to use our moral and our political authority on behalf of those who lack power. It means that sometimes we have to be a pain in the butt. There are three reasons I think we need to take our power to irritate and agitate more seriously. First, I'm not actually sure why else we exist. Secondly, it's a properly humble role for us to take. And finally, it's what it takes to get the job done. I'll unpack those things. No industry that I know of spends more time thinking and talking about itself than philanthropy. Confess. We do research to catalog the research we've done on ourselves. And yet, we spend very little time asking ourselves, why have we been given this unique and special place in society? After all, what other business has no customers? Other than community foundations, most of us have absolutely nobody that has to be happy about our decisions. Government regulators are disinclined or not permitted to second-guess our grant-making decisions, and our donors are either part of our organizations or no longer with us. The nonprofit sector surely doesn't have the luxury of choosing amongst us when they're looking for funds. Can you imagine? They've been so nice to me, I'm going to give them this great giving opportunity. In short, if we make somebody mad, as our friends in Pittsburgh did, we're insulated from almost any economic consequences. Even at a community foundation like the one I run in Berks County, where fundraising is part of our mission and our public image is important, we're far more insulated by our endowment from the repercussions of unpleasant publicity than other organizations. That's allowed our community foundation to ask some uncomfortable questions like, are we really funding and organizing our public libraries in a way that meets our community's needs? This made the libraries very uncomfortable as they feared that some of them might be closed, and it made our county government very uncomfortable, as Mark knows, because the answer was that they weren't funding them properly, and it was a very politically embarrassing answer. And we asked that question in our community very loudly because the people who really needed those libraries, poor people, the elderly, and children, couldn't ask that question loudly and publicly. Endowed foundations are insulated from market forces in ways that virtually no other organizations, and certainly no one in the social sector is. Now, our permanent endowments would be described by economists as nothing more than friction on the intergenerational transfer of wealth. So why are we allowed to hold on to these permanent piles of funds and guarantee ourselves something almost nobody else has, and that's permanent job security? Why indeed? Well, the only answer I can come up with is that those funds give us the independence to confront inequities in our society without the economic repercussions of raising those questions. In short, the willingness to irritate those who need to be irritated and to agitate for change when change is called for. There's simply no other reason I can think of that society would be willing to delay the gratification of spending our principal. There's a second reason as well, and people find it counterintuitive. I think that asking these challenging questions is appropriately humbling for us. Now, the words humility and foundation executive are not often used in the same sentence in the United States. Ours is not a profession with a large self-esteem problem. You know, it's very easy to sit in our office, to make grants, and to avoid the real challenges in our communities of dealing with nasty, unpleasant things like school boards, city councils, legislators, and governors. And remember that the president of the George Gunn Foundation called the Pittsburgh Foundation's actions arrogant. But I come down on the side of Teresa Hines, the chair of the Hines Endowments, who, in writing about the Pittsburgh actions, wrote that engaging in the battle for the soul of the Pittsburgh public schools meant that foundations were no longer white knights who rode in to save the day, but were forcing themselves to become partners in what she called, and I love this phrase, the rough and tumble enterprise of social change. That insulated bubble of economic protection can become an incubator for smugness and insularity. But breaking out of that bubble makes us appropriately humble in the tasks we seek to perform. When we break out of that bubble and we engage in the rough and tumble work of social change, we also find ourselves closer to the people who ultimately we seek to benefit. And the consequences of not doing that can be grave. Bill Shambra of the Hudson Institute has written extensively on the damage done to communities by foundations that supported the eugenics movement in the United States in the early part of the last century. While I famously disagree with Bill's generalizations about philanthropy, his work does point out the unintended consequences of well-intended but ill-informed actions. And it certainly points out the problem of philanthropic arrogance painted in the guise of the white knight trying to save the day. Engaging in the public debate and moving beyond grant-making brings us to a point of proper philanthropic humility. When I joined this field, a friend of mine who ran a large foundation called me and said, "You'll never hear an honest word or eat a bad meal again." And when I deal, and when you deal with grantees, and even most of the people in our communities, you know that we never have bad meals and we seldom hear honest words. But we have a neighborhood in Reading, in my hometown, that's become a source of some considerable tension. There are some developers, well-meaning, but who don't live in that neighborhood, and some foundations who also don't live in that neighborhood, who want to take this old and somewhat run-down, traditionally African-American neighborhood and revitalize it as an artist colony. I'm relieved to say that our foundation isn't part of this effort. We don't support it, and while it's not part of the text that will ultimately be released from this speech, we're going to make darn sure it doesn't happen. Last year, our community foundation funded the reconstruction of a neighborhood playground in that neighborhood. And while I was at the playground, one of the women from the neighborhood came up to me and said, "Mr. Murphy, if artists are going to live here, where are we going to live?" What a humbling moment. It would be so easy for us to sit in our offices and write checks to redevelop this neighborhood. But the words of that woman, the people you meet when you engage in the rough and tumble business of social change, will inform your thinking in ways that none of our research studies can. We need to challenge the unchallenged because it's why it exists and it makes us appropriately humble. And we need to irritate and agitate because we hold this special place. The final reason is that philanthropy is learning every day. We simply cannot accomplish our jobs unless we step out and stand up for the principles we were established to support. When it comes to asking hard questions or confronting unpleasant facts in our communities, or countries for that matter, we certainly can't rely on the news media. It's a subject for a second speech, but I can assure you that the decline of journalism is a global phenomenon. We certainly can't expect the poor to confront power and demand changes. The children, or for that matter, the parents of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, didn't have the clout those foundations, and in the end, making their lives better is our job. No matter how we describe the unusual work that we do at cocktail parties, none of us seriously think that our donors established foundations to manage assets and distribute grants. Let me assure you that nobody ever in the history of mankind sat down at their breakfast table with their spouse and said, "Dear, let's establish a permanent, irrevocable philanthropic trust to invest our residual assets in a broadly diversified portfolio of securities and distribute a predetermined percentage of those assets annually to some pre-approved or potentially innovative charitable institutions." Never happened once. Our institutions were born out of a passion to improve the lives of others. In the early 1980s, Gerald Panis wrote a book called Mega Gifts, in which he interviewed hundreds of people who had made gifts of $1 million or more to understand what their motives were. And in my book, it's still the only book on fundraising that's worth reading, Panis' consistent finding over and over was that the donors said they gave the money to make something important happen. They didn't talk about their taxes. They didn't talk about being immortalized. They didn't talk about public recognition. They didn't talk about intergenerational transfers. They talked about their passion for change. Those passions are often expressed in our founding documents, and it's clear from those that our charge isn't to move money and paperwork, it's to make a difference. And if that means making a grant, by all means make a grant. If it means taking somebody to lunch to convince them to think differently, take them to lunch. But if it means calling out powerful forces in our community to do their job, well, we need to do that too. Being willing to irritate and agitate is reflective of our incredible and unique role in society, and it makes us properly humble in exercising that role. And sometimes it's what we do, what we have to do to get the job done. The story in Pittsburgh has a happy ending and an interesting twist. About a week after the foundations held that press conference, the mayor of Pittsburgh appointed a commission to recommend changes in the ways that the schools were operated. Later that year, the voters turned out the president of the school board and several other members of the board left as well. The situation in the school governance improved to the point that less than 2 years after their press conference, the foundations restarted their funding to the school district. Now, 11 years later, the district continues to improve, and while all of America's urban school districts have challenges, people in Pittsburgh are working hard together to improve the educational opportunities that their children have. In fact, the situation has improved so much that those same foundations, along with other major business enterprises in the community, have come together in the past 3 years to create the Pittsburgh Promise, which guarantees a college education to the graduates of each of those Pittsburgh schools. Now, it wouldn't be right to attribute all of that progress to a bold move by the foundations, because there are always other forces at work. But everyone involved will point to that day in the summer of 2002 as the catalyst that forced teachers, the school board, local and state government to confront the hard realities that were in front of them about the district's problem. That's the happy ending. Here's the twist. You all are foundation people, and you've all been sitting there wondering, how much money did these 3 foundations give to the Pittsburgh public schools every year? Well, The answer to that is $3.5 million. Pittsburgh Public Schools had a $1 billion budget in 2002. That's right. All of that institutional change, the conversion of a school district from one that was failing its children to one that's a national model and now guarantees its graduates a college education, was created by a group of foundations that provided 1/3 of 1% of the school district's budget. We need to irritate and agitate sometimes because it's necessary, and I can't imagine why else we were created. By breaking out of the traditional quiet mode of grant making, we make ourselves servants of the communities that we serve, and that's an appropriately humble place for us to be. And we need to do it because, as the Pittsburgh Foundation's found out, even if you're only 1/3 of 1% of the budget, you can do it, and sometimes you have to. Go, be outspoken.